Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Snuff by Terry Pratchett, Part 6. Next morning, Vimes, hand in hand with his son, walked toward the house of Miss Beadle thoughtfully, not knowing what to expect. He had little experience of the literary world, much preferring the literal one, and he had heard that writers spent all day in their dressing gowns, drinking champagne. Footnote. This is, of course, absolutely true. End footnote. On the other hand, as he approached the place, up another little lane, some reconsideration began to take place. For one thing, the cottage had a garden that would do credit to a farm. When he looked over the fence, he saw lines of vegetables and soft fruit, and there was an orchard and what was probably a pigsty, and over there a proper outdoor privy, very professionally done, with the very nearly compulsory crescent moon shape fret sawed into the door, and the log pile close at hand so that the most efficient use could be made of every trip down the path. The whole place had a sensible and serious air, and certainly wasn't what you would expect of somebody who just mucked about with words every day. Miss Beadle opened the door a fraction of a second after he had knocked. She didn't look surprised. "I was rather expecting you, Your Grace," she said. "Or is it Mr. Policeman today? From what I hear, it's always Mr. Policeman, one way or the other." Then she looked down. "And this must be young Sam." She glanced up at his father and said, "They tend to get rather tongue-tied, don't they?" "You know, I've got lots of poo," said young Sam proudly. "I keep it in jam jars, and I've got a laboratory in the lavatory. Have you got any elephant poo? It goes," and here he paused for effect, "dung!" For a moment, Miss Beadle had that slightly glazed sheen often seen on the face of someone meeting young Sam for the first time. She looked at Vimes. "You must be very proud of him," the proud father said. "It's very hard to keep up. I know that." Miss Beadle led the way out of the hall and into a room in which chintz played a major part. Chintz, Chintz, a printed calico from India, chintz, a usually glazed printed cotton fabric, chintz. Miss Beadle led the way out of the hall and into a room in which chintz played a major part, and drew young Sam over to a large bureau. She opened a drawer and handed the boy what looked like a small book. "This is a bound proof of the joy of earwax, and I shall sign it for you if you like." Young Sam took it like one receiving a holy object, and his father, temporarily becoming his mum, said, "What do you say?" To which young Sam responded with a beam and a thank you and a, "Please don't scribble on it. I'm not allowed to scribble in books." While young Sam was happily turning the pages of his new book, his father was introduced to an overstuffed chair. Miss Beadle gave him a smile and hurried off toward the kitchen, leaving Vimes with not much to look at except for a room full of bookcases, more overstuffed furniture, and a full-sized concert harp, and a wall clock made to look like an owl, whose eyes swung backward and forward hypnotically in time with the tick, presumably to the point where you either committed suicide or picked up the poker in the hearth nearby and beat the damn thing until the springs broke. While Vimes was warmly contemplating this, he realized that he was being watched, and he looked round into the worried face and prognathous jaw of the goblin called Tears of the Mushroom. Prognathous, being or having a jaw, and typically a lower jaw that projects forward, especially to an unusual degree. Prognathous. While Vimes was warmly contemplating this, he realized that he was being watched, and he looked around into the worried face and prognathous jaw of the goblin called Tears of the Mushroom. Instinctively, he looked at young Sam, and suddenly the biggest raisin in his cake of apprehension was, what will young Sam do? How many books has he read? They haven't told him nasty tales about goblins, have they? Or read him too many of those innocent, colourful fairy tale books which contain nightmares ready to leap out and some needless fear that will cause trouble one day? And what young Sam did was march across the floor, stop dead in front of the girl and say, I know a lot about poo. It's very interesting. Tears of the Mushroom looked frantically for Miss Beadle, while young Sam, totally at ease, began a brief dissertation on sheep poo. In response, with words slapping together like little bricks, she said, What is poo for? Young Sam frowned at this as if somebody was questioning his life's work. Then he looked up brightly and said, Without poo, you would go off bang! And he stood there beaming, the meaning of life completely solved. And Tears of the Mushroom laughed. It was a rather staccato laugh, reminding Vimes of the laughter of certain kinds of women after certain kinds of too much gin. But it was laughter, straight, genuine, and unaffected, and young Sam bathed in it, giggling. And so did Sam Vimes, with sweat beginning to cool on his neck. Then young Sam said, I wish I had big hands like you. What's your name? In that clipped way Vimes was learning to recognize, the goblin girl said, I am the Tears of the Mushroom. Instantly, young Sam threw his arms around as much of her as he could encompass and shouted, Mushrooms shouldn't cry! The look that the goblin girl gave Vimes was one that he had seen many times before on the face of someone in receipt of young Sam's hugs. A mixture of surprise and what Vimes had to call nonplussedness. At this point, Miss Beadle came back into the room holding a plate, which she passed to Tears of the Mushroom. Please be so good as to serve our guests, my dear. Tears of the Mushroom picked up the plate and tentatively pushed it toward Vimes and said something that sounded like half a dozen coconuts rolling downstairs, but somehow managed to include the syllables you and eat and I make. There seemed to be a pleading in her expression, as if trying to make him understand. Vimes stared at her face a while and then thought, well, I could understand, couldn't I? It has to be worth a try, and closed his eyes an errand of some dubiousness when you were face to longer face with a jaw like that. With eyes firmly shut and one hand over them to cut out the last vestige of light, he said, "Will you say that again, young lady?" And in the darkness of his skull he heard quite clearly, "I have baked biscuits today, Mr. Policeman. I washed my hands," she added nervously. "They are clean and tasty. This I have said, and it is a thing exact." Baked by a goblin, thought Vimes, as he opened his eyes and took a knobbly but appetizing-looking biscuit from the plate in front of him, then shut his eyes again and asked, "Why does the mushroom cry?" In the dark he heard the goblin girl gasp and then say, "It cries so that there are many more mushrooms. This is a certain thing." Vimes heard the faint chink of crockery behind him, but as he took his hands away from his eyes, Miss Beadle said, "No, stay in darkness, Commander. So it's true what the dwarves say about you." "I wouldn't know. What do the dwarves say about me, Miss Beadle?" Vimes opened his eyes. Miss Beadle sat down on a chair almost opposite, while Tears of the Mushroom waited for more biscuit activity with the air of someone who would probably wait forever or until told not to. She looked imploringly at Vimes and then at young Sam, who was studying Tears of the Mushroom with interest, although, knowing young Sam, most of the interest had to do with the plate of biscuits. So he said, "Okay, lad, you may ask the lady for a biscuit, but mind your manners." "They say that the dark is in you, Commander, but you keep it in a cage. A present from Coombe Valley, they say." Vimes blinked in the light. "A dwarf superstition in a goblin cave? You know a lot about dwarves." "Quite a lot," said Miss Beadle, "but far more about goblins. And they believe in the summoning dark, just like the dwarves. After all, they are both creatures of the caves, and the summoning dark is real. It's not all in your head, Commander, no matter what you hear. I sometimes hear it too. Oh dear, you of all people must recognize a substition when you're possessed by it. It's the opposite of a superstition. It's real even if you don't believe in it. My mother taught me that. She was a goblin." Vimes looked at the pleasant brown-haired woman in front of him and said politely, "No." "All right. Perhaps you'll allow me a little theatricality and misdirection for effect. Truthfully, my mother was found as a child when she was 3 and raised by goblins in Uberwald, until she was about 11. And I say about because she was never quite certain about the passage of time. She pretty much thought and acted like a goblin and picked up their language, which is insanely difficult to learn if you're not brought up to it. She ate with them, had her own plot in the mushroom farm, and was very highly thought of among them for the way she looked after the rat farm. She once told me that until she met my father, all her best recollections were of those years in the goblin cave." Miss Beadle stirred her coffee and continued. "And she also told me her worst recollections, the ones that haunted her nightmares and, I might say, haunt mine now. Of one day after some nearby humans had found out that there was a golden-haired, pink-cheeked human girl running around underground with evil, treacherous brutes who, as everybody knows, eat babies. Well, She screamed and fought as they tried to take her away, especially since people who she had thought of as family were being slaughtered around her. There was a pause, and Vimes glanced somewhat fearfully at young Sam, who, thankfully, had returned to the joy of earwax and was therefore oblivious of all else. "You haven't touched your coffee, Commander. You're just holding it in your hand and looking at me." Vimes took a deep draught of very hot coffee, which at the moment suited him just fine. He said, "This is true. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say." Tears of the Mushroom was watching him carefully, ready should he feel a biscuit attack coming on. They were, in fact, pretty good, and to hide his confusion, he thanked her and took another one. "Best not to say anything, then," said Miss Beadle. "All slaughtered for no reason. It happens. Everybody knows there are worthless people, don't they? I tell you, Commander, it's true that some of the most terrible things in the world are done by people who genuinely think, that they're doing it for the best, especially if there is some God involved. Well, it took a lot of those things, and quite a lot of time, to convince a little girl that she wasn't one of the nasty goblins anymore, and was really one of the human beings who were not nasty at all, because one day they were certain she would understand that all this terrible business with the bucket of cold water and the beatings every time she spoke in the goblin tongue or started absent-mindedly to sing a goblin song was in her best interest. Fortunately, although she probably didn't think so at the time, she was strong and clever, and she learned to be a good girl, learned to wear proper dresses and eat with a knife and fork, and kneel down to pray her thanks for all that she was receiving, including the beatings. And she learned not to be a goblin so successfully that they allowed her to work in the garden, where she vaulted over the wall. They never broke her, and she said to me that there would always be some goblin in her. I never met my father. According to my mother, he was a decent and hard-working man, and a considerate and understanding one too, I suspect. Miss Beadle stood up and brushed at her dress, as if trying to remove the crumbs of history. Standing there in the chintzy room with the harp in it, she said, "I don't know who those people were who killed the goblins and beat my mother, but if I ever found out, I would slaughter them without a thought, because good people have no business being so bad. Goodness is about what you do, not what you pray to, and that's how it went," she said. "My father was a jeweler, and he soon found out that my mother was absolutely gifted in that respect, probably because of her goblin background that led her to have a feel for stones. I'm sure that made up for having a wife who would swear in goblin when she was annoyed. And let me tell you, a good goblin swear can go on for at least a quarter of an hour. She wasn't one for the books, as you might expect, but my dad had been. And one day I thought, how hard can writing be? After all, most of the words are going to be and, the, and I, and it, and so on, and there's a huge number to choose from, so a lot of the work has already been done for you. That was 57 books ago. It seems to have worked." Miss Beadle sat back down in her chair and leaned forward. "They have the most complex language you could possibly imagine, Commander. The meaning of every word is contingent on the words around it, the speaker, the listener, the time of year, the weather, and so many other things. They have something equivalent to what we think of as poetry. They use and control fire, and about 3 years ago, nearly all of them in this countryside were rounded up and carted away because they were a nuisance. Isn't that why you're here? Vimes took a deep breath. Actually, Miss Beadle, I came here to see my wife's family estate and let my lad learn about the countryside, in the process of which I've already been arrested on suspicion of killing a blacksmith and have seen the brutally slaughtered body of a goblin woman. On top of this, I have no knowledge of the whereabouts of said blacksmith, and Miss Beadle would like somebody to enlighten me, preferably yourself. Yes, I saw the poor thing, and I'm sorry that I can't tell you where Jethro is. Vimes stared at her and thought, she's probably telling the truth. He's not hiding in some part of the mine, is he? No, I've looked everywhere. No note, nothing, and his parents have no idea either. He's a bit of a free spirit, but he's not the sort of person to go away without telling me. She looked down, clearly embarrassed. The silence said a lot. Vimes broke it by saying, the murder of that poor girl on the hill will not go unpunished while I live. I'm taking it personally, you might say. I think someone was trying to set me up and mud sticks. He paused. Tell me, these pots the goblins make, do they carry them around all the time? Well, yes, of course, but only the ones they're filling at the moment, obviously, said Miss Beadle with a trace of annoyance. Is this relevant? Well, a policeman, you might say, thinks in goblin language. Everything is contingent on everything else. Incidentally, how many other people know that you have a tunnel into the hill? What makes you think I have a tunnel going into the hill? Oh, let me see now. This place is practically at the foot of the hill, and if I lived here, I'd have dug out a decent wine cellar for myself. That's one reason, and the other is because I saw the flash in your eyes when I asked you the question. Would you like me to ask you the question again? The woman opened her mouth to speak, and Vimes raised a finger. Not finished yet. What isn't as simple is the fact that the other day you arrived in the cave without anybody seeing you walk up the hill. Everyone tells me that there are eyes watching you everywhere in the country, and, as luck would have it, I had a few working for me yesterday. Please, don't waste my time. You've committed no crime that I know of. You understand being kind to goblins is not a crime. He thought about that and added, although perhaps some people round here might think it is. But I don't, and I'm not stupid, Miss Beadle. I saw that goblin head in the pub. It looked as if it's been there for years. Now, I just want to go back up to the cave without anybody seeing me, if you don't mind, because I have a few questions to ask. Miss Beadle said, You want to interrogate the goblins? No, that word suggests that I mean to bully them. I simply have to obtain the information I need to know before I start to investigate the murder of the girl. If you don't want to help me, I'm afraid that will be your choice. The next day, Sergeant Cullen did not turn up for work. Mrs. Cullen sent a note around by a boy as soon as she got back from work herself. Footnote. The Cullens had survived a long and happy marriage by having as little to do with the other partner as possible. This was achieved by the expedient of his working the night shift when she was working days, and vice versa. This was agreed on the basis that anything else would spoil the romance. End footnote. There was nothing romantic about Fred Cullen, when she got home. And so after sweeping the floor, doing the washing up, wiping all the surfaces, and spending some time teasing out the lumps of mud that had got caught on the doormat, she made haste to Sodopolis Yard, after visiting her friend Mildred, who had a rather nice porcelain jug and basin set she wanted to sell. When she eventually got to the watch house, she explained that Fred was terribly poorly and sweating cobs and gabbling about rabbits. Sergeant Littlebottom was sent to investigate and returned looking solemn as she climbed the steps to Vimes's office, now occupied by Captain Carrot. You could tell he was the occupant now, not simply because he was sitting in the chair, which was a persuasive hint, but also because all the paperwork was done and aligned, a trait which always impressed Inspector A.E. Pessimal, a small man who had the heart of a lion and the physical strength of a kitten and the face, disposition, and general demeanor that would make even hardened accountants say, "Just look at him. Doesn't he look like a typical accountant to you?" But this didn't worry the lion heart of A.E. Pessimal. He was the watch's secret weapon. There wasn't a bookkeeper in the city who would like to see a visit from A.E. Pessimal unless, of course, he was perfectly innocent, although generally that could be ruled out, because Mr. and Mrs. Pessimal's little boy could track an error all the way through the ledger and down into the cellar where the real books had been hidden. And all Inspector A.E. Pessimal wanted for his genius was a meticulously calculated wage and a chance, every now and then, to go out on the streets with a real policeman, swinging his truncheon and glaring at trolls. Carrot leaned back. "So how's Fred getting on, Sherry?" "Nothing much that I can see, really. That was a big Sherry." The trouble was that Captain Carrot had a friendly, honest, and open face that made you want to tell him things. It didn't help that Sergeant Littlebottom held a small torch for the captain. Even though he was well and truly spoken for, he was also a dwarf. Well, technically, and you can't help how you dream. "Well," she began reluctantly. Carrot leaned forward. "Yes, Sherry?" She gave in. "Well, sir, it's you. You come from Copperhead. Did you run into many goblins up there?" "No, but I know that you is their religion, if you can call it that." Sherry Littlebottom shook her head, trying to get out of her mind some speculation about the part a reasonably high stool might play in a relationship, and telling herself that Sergeant Hammer of Gold over in the Dolly Sisters' watch house caught her eye every time she was busily catching his eye when they happened to meet on patrol, and was probably a really good catch if she could pluck up the courage to ask him if he was actually male. Footnote. Strictly speaking, the sexuality of any given dwarf remained a secret between him, or, as it might be, her, and his, or, as it might be, her mother, until they decided to tell someone else about it. Although, generally, you could work it out by observing dwarves closely, and spotting the ones that were drinking sherry or light white wine. Regrettably, this didn't always work with dwarf policemen, because like all policemen everywhere, they would drink anything strong enough to help them forget what they'd to deal with that day. End footnote. If she could pluck up the courage to ask him if he was actually male. She said, "Angu is not a religion. It's a superstition. The goblins don't believe in tuck." Footnote. According to dwarf lore, the universe was written into being by Tuck, who also wrote its laws. All writing is sacred to the dwarves. End footnote. She said, Angu is not a religion, it's a superstition. The goblins don't believe in Tuck, sir. They're savages, scavengers, but... She hesitated again. There's something I was told once, and it's unbelievable, but sometimes they eat their baby, sir. Or at least, the mother will eat her child, her newborn child, if there's famine. Can you believe that? Carrot's mouth dropped open for a moment, and then a small voice said, Yes, I think I can, Sergeant, if you would excuse my saying so. A.E. Pessimer looked defiantly at their expressions and tried to stand a little straighter. It's a matter of logic, you see. No food, but the mother may survive by reconsuming the child, as it were. Whereas if all other food has been exhausted, then the child will die. In fact, the child is dead as soon as the conundrum is postulated. The mother, on the other hand, might, by doing so, survive for long enough for more food to be found and become available, and in the course of time may bear another child. You know, that is a very accountancy thing to say, said Sherry. A.E. Pessimer remained calm. Thank you, Sergeant Littlebottom. I shall take that as a compliment, because the logic is impeccable. It's what is known as the dreadful logic of necessity. I'm well versed in the logistics of survival situations. The chair creaked as Captain Carrot leaned forward. No offence meant, Inspector Pessimer, but may I inquire as to what kind of issues of survival arise during double-entry bookkeeping? A.E. Pessimer sighed. It can get pretty hazardous as the end of the fiscal year draws near, Captain. However, I take your point and would like you to understand that I believe I have read every single memoir, manual, log, and message in a bottle, by which I mean, of course, message taken from a bottle, that is currently available, and I can assure you that you would be amazed at the terrible decisions that sometimes have to be made by a group of people so that some, if not all, may live. Classically, we have the shipwrecked sailors adrift in an open boat, far on the ocean, with succor extremely unlikely. Succor, S-U-C-C-O-R, relief, aid, help. Something that furnishes relief, succor. With succor extremely unlikely. Generally, the procedure is to eat one another's legs, although sooner or later the supply of legs is going to run, if I may use the word, out. And then arises the question, who will die so that some may live? Dreadful algebra, Captain. Only then did A.E. Pessimer blush. I'm sorry. I know that I am a small, weak man, but I have amassed a large library. I dream of dangerous places. Perhaps you should walk through the shades, Inspector, said Carrot. You wouldn't have to dream. Do carry on, Sherry. Sherry Littlebottom shrugged. Ugh. But eating your own child, that's got to be wrong, yes? Well, Sergeant, said A.E. Pessimer, I have read about such things, and if you think of the outcomes, which are the death of both mother and child, or the death of the child but the possible life of the mother, the conclusion must be that her decision is right. In his book, A Banquet of Worms, Colonel F.J. Massingham does mention this about the goblins, and apparently, according to the goblins' worldview, a consumed child, which clearly did emerge from the mother, has been returned whence it came, and will hopefully be reborn anew at some future date, when circumstances are more favourable, with, therefore, no actual harm done. You may think that this view does not stand up to scrutiny, but when you're faced with the dreadful algebra, the world becomes quite a different place. There was silence while they all contemplated this. Carrot said. You know how it is in a street fight, Sherry. Sometimes, if things get hot and you know it's you or them, that's when you do the algebra. Fred doesn't seem to know where he is, said Sherry. He wasn't running a temperature, and his bedroom isn't particularly warm, but he acts as if he's very hot, and he won't let go of that damn little pot. He shouts if anyone tries even to get near it. Actually, he screamed at me. And that's another thing. His voice has changed. He sounds like a man who's gargling rocks. I had a word with Ponder Stibbins at the university, but they don't appear to have anyone who knows anything much about goblins. Captain Carrot raised his eyebrows. Are you sure? I know for a fact that they have a professor of dust, miscellaneous particles and filaments, and you tell me that there's no expert on an entire species of talking humanoids? That's about right, sir. All we could turn up was stuff about what a bloody nuisance they are. You know the kind of thing. Nobody knows anything about goblins. I mean, stuff worth knowing. A.E. Pessimal actually saluted. Harry King does, Captain. There's quite a few of them downriver. They don't come into town much, though. You may remember that Lord Veterinary was gracious enough to ask for me to be seconded to the revenue in order that I might go through Mr. King's returns, given that all the other tax officers were frightened to set foot on his property. I myself, sir, was not frightened, said A.E. Pessimal proudly, because I am protected by my badge and the majesty of the law. Harry King might throw a taxman out of the building, but he's clever enough not to try that with one of Commander Vimes's men. No, indeed. You could have lit the city with the proud glow from A.E. Pessimal's face, as he tried to puff out a chest that mostly went in. It became a little more swollen when Carrot said, Very well done, Inspector. You're a mean man with a smoking abacus indeed. I think I shall pay a visit to our old friend Harry first thing in the morning. Vimes did some thinking about the problem of taking young Sam to a crime scene, but frankly, the lad was showing himself to be up to just about any encounter. Besides, any lad wants to go and see where his dad works. He looked down at his son. Would you be scared of a long walk in the dark, lad? With me and these ladies? Young Sam looked solemn for a moment, and then said, I think I'll let Mr. Whistle do the being scared, and then it won't bother me. The door to the secret tunnel, if indeed it was secret, was in Miss Beadle's cellar, which had quite a well-appointed wine rack and a general not unpleasant smell of, well, a cellar. But once through the door there was a smell of distant goblins. It was a long walk in the dark, especially when you were obliged to walk up quite a steep slope very nearly on hands and knees. The smell of goblins grew stronger after a while, but during that while you tended to get used to it. Here and there light shone into the gloom from holes to the outside world, which Vimes thought was sensible engineering until he realized that rabbits used this tunnel too, and had left plenty of droppings as evidence. He wondered whether he should pocket a few samples for young Sam's collection, and suggested this to young Sam, toiling manfully behind him, who said, No, Dad, got rabbits. Want elephant if we find one. Rabbit poo, Vimes noticed, was about the size of a chocolate raisin, a thought which instantly dragged him back to his youth, when, if by some means never entirely legal, he had acquired some cash, he would spend it on a ticket to the Flea Pit Music Hall and buy a packet of chocolate raisins with the change. Nobody knew or cared to guess what the things were that scuttled and scratched down below the seats. But you soon learned a very important rule. If you dropped your chocolate raisins, it was vitally important not to pick them up. Vimes stopped, causing Miss Beadle to walk into the sack of apples that she had asked him to carry, and got a grip on himself sufficiently to say, "I'd like a moment or two to catch my breath, Miss Beadle. Sorry, not as young as I was and all that. I'll catch you up. What are we carrying these bags for anyway?" "Fruit and vegetables, Commander." "What? To goblins? I'd have thought they found their own food." Miss Beadle inched her way around him and climbed on into the dark, saying over her shoulder, "Yes, they do." Vimes sat with young Sam for a moment until he felt better and said, "How are you doing, lad?" In the dark, a small voice said, "I told Mr. Whistle not to worry, Dad, because he's a bit silly." So is your father, thought Vimes, and is probably going to continue to be so. But he was on the chase. One way or another, he was on the chase. Who you were chasing could wait. The chasing was the thing. Anger helped Vimes up the last leg of the climb. Anger at himself and whoever it was who had punctured his holiday. But it was worrying. He had wanted something to happen, and now it had. Somebody was dead. Sometimes you had to take a look at yourself and then look away. He found Miss Beadle in Tears of the Mushroom waiting with a dozen or so other ladies. It was a calculated guess, given that he had yet to find any reliable way of telling one goblin from another, except, of course, that Tears of the Mushroom was wearing her apron with pockets, which he hadn't seen before, and apparently neither had the other ladies, since Tears of the Mushroom was now the hit of the season as far as her sisters were concerned, given that they currently wore daring little outfits of old sacking, plaited grasses, and rabbit skin. They gathered around her chorusing, presumably the goblin equivalent of, "Oh my dear, you look fabulous." Footnote. However that might be rendered in a language that at its best sounded like a man jumping up and down on a very large packet of crisps. End footnote. They gathered around her chorusing, presumably, the goblin equivalent of, "Oh my dear, you look fabulous." Miss Beadle sidled up to Vimes and said, "I know what you're thinking, but it's a start. Carrying things, useful things, without having to use your hands. Well, that's a step in the right direction." She pulled Vimes a little way from the newly formed goblin branch of the Women's Institute, who had by now attracted the attention of young Sam, whose cheerful reluctance to be overawed by anything had clearly won over the girls, resulting in his being where he always felt he should be, the center of attention. It was a knack. Miss Beadle went on, "If you want to change a whole people, then you start with the girls. It stands to reason they learn faster, and they pass on what they learn to their children. I suppose you're wondering why we were trekking up here with all the sacks?" Behind them, the apron was being tried on by one girl after another, this year's must-have item. Vimes turned back to the woman and said, "Well, this is just a guess, but I see a lot of rabbit bones around the place, and I have heard that you can die if you live only on rabbit. Only I don't know why this is." Miss Beadle lit up. "Well, Commander Vimes, you've certainly gone up in my estimation. Yes, rabbit has been the scourge of the goblin nation. I understand it depletes the body of some vital nutrient if you don't eat other things as well. Just about any green stuff will do, but the male goblins think a proper meal is a rabbit on a stick." She sighed. "Dwarves know about this, and they are absolutely fanatical about good food, as you should be if you spend much of your time underground. But nobody cared to tell the goblins, as if they would listen anyway, and so bad health and premature death is their lot. Some survive, of course, mostly those who prefer rat or eat the whole rabbit, not just the more apparently edible bits, or they simply eat their vegetables." She began to unfasten a sack of cabbages and continued. "I was well in with the wife of the head man here, because he got sick, and I made certain he got a few good meals. Of course, he swears it was because he did the magic, but his wife was remarkably sensible, and the other males don't worry about what the girls get up to, so they slip fruit and veg into their stews, saying they're magical, and so they have children who survive, and thus we change the world one meal at a time. That is, if the goblins get a chance to live at all." She looked sadly at the gossiping girls and said, "What they really need is a first-class theologian. Because, you see, they agree with the rest of the world. They think they're rubbish. They think they did something very bad a long time ago, and because of it, they've lived like they do. They think they have it coming to them, as you might say." Vimes frowned. He couldn't remember ever going into a church or temple, or one of the numerous other places of more or less spirituality, for any other reason than the occasional requirements of the job. These days he tended to go in for reasons of Sybil, i.e., his wife dragging him along so that he could be seen and, if possible, seen remaining awake. No, the world of next worlds, afterlives, and purgatorial destinations simply did not fit into his head. Whether you wanted it or not, you were born. You did the best you could, and then, whether you really wanted to or not, you died. They were the only certainties, and so the best thing for a copper to do was to get on with the job. And it was about time that Sam Vimes got back to doing his. Young Sam at this point had tired of petticoat company and had drifted over to an elderly goblin man who was working on a pot and was watching with extreme fascination, to the apparent pleasure, as far as Vimes could tell, of the elderly goblin. "That's a lesson to us. I don't know what kind of lesson, but it's a lesson," he thought. Vimes waited until Miss Beadle returned from discussing the possible new fashion explosion with the girls, then politely asked her, "Did the victim have any undue pots on her?" "I would be amazed if she hadn't," said Miss Beadle. "One or two at the very least, but probably the quite small ones for use during the day." "I see," said Vimes. "But were any found on her, afterward, I mean, if she was laid out?" He didn't know what the protocol was and continued. "Look, Miss Beadle, is it possible that she had an undue pot on her that's now missing? I know they're valuable, of course. They're shiny." "I don't know, but I'll go and ask the Cold Bone Wakes. He's the head goblin. He'll know." That reminded Vimes. Feeling embarrassed, he delved into his pocket and took out a small package, very, very carefully wrapped, and handed it to Miss Beadle with a pleading look. "I believe this belonged to the dead girl," he said. "A stone ring with a little blue bead in it. Can you see that it gets to someone here who'll value it?" All she had was a stone ring, he thought, and even that got taken away. There were times when the world did not need policemen, because what it really did need was for somebody who knew what they were doing to shut it all down and start it all up again, so that this time it could be done properly. But before despair could entirely set in, Miss Beadle was back and excited. "How apposite that you should ask that question, Commander! One of them was missing! Undue cat!" Apposite, highly pertinent or appropriate, apt, apposite. "How apposite that you should ask that question, Commander! One of them was missing! Undue cat!" Vimes could register absolute flat-faced incomprehension as well as any copper born. It radiated a searchlight of ignorance, but that was fine because Miss Beadle was prepared to be a fountainhead of information. "I'm sure you know what everybody knows, Commander, which is that goblins do, I might say religiously, store certain bodily secretions in pots, in the belief that these must be reunited with their corpse when they are buried. This obligation is called undue. All goblins must, by custom, which is very strict among goblins, maintain the undue had, the trinity of snot, nail clippings, and earwax. The missing pot in this case is the pot of cat, which contains nail clippings. Don't get misled by the word cat. Felines don't come into the picture. It's simply that there are only so many syllables in the world." "And this is the first time you've heard that it's missing, Miss Beadle?" "Well, this is my first time down here since yesterday, and it's a difficult time to talk to her family, as you may imagine." "I see," said Vimes, though he didn't. Not very much, although he could sense a tiny bead of light growing in the darkness of his mind. He glanced again at young Sam, who was studying the pot maker with every sign of forensic interest. "That's my boy," he continued. "Did they look for the pot?" "Looked everywhere, Commander, even outside, and it'll be quite small. You see, every goblin makes a set of pots which are kept deep inside the cave. I don't know where they are, though in most other things they trust me. This is because humans steal pots. For this reason, most goblins make other, comparatively small pots for daily use and for when they leave the cave, and decant them into larger pots later in secret." She tried to smile and said, "I'm sure this seems quite outlandish to you, Commander, but the making and maintaining of the pots is to them a religion in itself." At this point, Samuel Vimes was not keen to be heard giving his views about pots, so he contented himself with saying, "Is it possible that another goblin might have stolen the pot? Anyway, what sizes are quite small?" Miss Beadle gave him a surprised look. "If you trust me on anything, Commander, trust me on this. No goblin would dream of stealing another goblin's pot. The concept of doing so would be totally alien to them, I assure you. The size? Oh, usually smaller to a lady's compact or perhaps a snuff box. They have a shine on them like opals." "Yes," said Vimes, "I know." And he thought bright colours in the dark. He said, I don't want to be difficult, but could I borrow another of the poor lady's pots? I might need one to show people what it is I'm looking for. Miss Beadle looked surprised again. That would be impossible, but I think that if I talked to Tears of the Mushroom, she might, just might, loan you one of hers, in which case I may say you will be a very special person, Commander. A pot usually changes hands only because of distress, but Tears of the Mushroom spends a lot of time with me and has learned, shall I say, the uses of flexible thinking, and, if I may say so, she has taken a little bit of a shine to you. She walked away, leaving the startled Vimes and young Sam to their own devices. Here and there, goblins were doing whatever they did, tending small fires, sleeping, or in many cases, fussing with their pots. And a few just sat there staring blankly at nothing at all, like a policeman wondering how you spell phantasmagorical. Phantasmagorical, or phantasmagoria, an exhibition of optical effects and illusions, a constantly shifting complex succession of things seen or imagined, a scene that constantly changes. Phantasmagoria, a bizarre or fantastic combination, collection, or assemblage. Phantasmagoria. And a new image dragged itself out of Vimes's memory. It was of a lot of little blue men shouting, "Crivens!" Ah, yes, the Knack-Mack Feegle. They lived in holes in the ground as well. Admittedly, these were said to be rather more salubrious than this midden-ridden cave system. Salubrious. Favorable to or promoting health or well-being. Salubrious. Admittedly, these were said to be rather more salubrious than this midden-ridden cave system. But, however you looked at it, they were in the same situation as the goblins. They lived on the edge too, but they danced on the edge. They jumped up and down on it, made faces at it, thumbed their snotty noses at it, refused to see the peril of their situation, and, in general, seemed to have a huge appetite for life, alcohol, adventure, and alcohol. As a copper, he shouldn't say it, because they could be a bloody nuisance. But there was something commendable about the cheerfully feisty way they faced, well, everything. Somebody tugged at his sleeve. He looked down into the face of Tears of the Mushroom, with Miss Beadle standing over her like a chaperone. The other goblin girls stood behind the pair of them like an amphibian chorus. The solemn voice from the little face said, "Hearts must give, Mr. Policeman." With dreadful bad timing, Miss Beadle broke in like an overactive schoolteacher, and Vimes was privately overjoyed to see a brief look of annoyance on Tears of the Mushroom's face. "She means that if she is to trust you with a pot, then you must trust her with something equally valuable. I suppose you would call it a hostage situation?" "No, I wouldn't," Vimes thought, looking into the dark eyes of the goblin girl. That was a strange thing. When he got past the features, which at best could be considered homely, depending on what kind of home you had in mind, the eyes were as human as you could imagine. They had a depth that not even the brightest animal could achieve. He reached for his wallet, and Miss Beadle said sharply, "Money won't do!" He ignored her and finished, pulling out the picture of young Sam that he took everywhere, and carefully passed it to Tears of the Mushroom, who took it as if holding a rare and delicate object, which, from the point of view of Vimes, it certainly was. She looked at it, then down at the boy himself, who gave her a cheery smile, and her eyes confirmed that the grimace on her face was in fact an answering smile. For young Sam, the Goblin Cave was an interesting fairyland. You had to admire his ability not to be immediately frightened of anything. Tears of the Mushroom looked back at the picture, and then back at young Sam, and then at the face of Vimes. She tucked the picture carefully into her apron and pulled out her hand, holding a small, iridescent pot. Iridescence, a lustrous, rainbow-like play of color caused by differential refraction of light waves, as from an oil slick, soap bubble, or fish scales, that tends to change as the angle of view changes. A lustrous or attractive quality or effect. Iridescence. She tucked the picture carefully into her apron and pulled out her hand, holding a small, iridescent pot. She held it out to Vimes, her hand trembling slightly, and he found himself taking it gingerly in both hands. Then Tears of the Mushroom said in her strange voice, like a living filing cabinet, "Hearts have given," which almost brought Vimes to his knees. He thought, it could just as well have been her head grinning on the pub wall. Someone is going to burn. In the back of his mind, a cheerful voice said, "Well done, Commander Vimes. At last you are singing from my hymn sheet." He ignored it. Feeling the little pot, it was as smooth as skin, whatever it was made to contain. And he wasn't going to ask. The contents were masked by a carved latticework of flowers and mushrooms. In the cool depths of his cellar, Mr. Jiminy, the publican, was preparing for the evening rush when he heard a sound in the darkness among the barrels. He dismissed it as being yet another rat until a hand was clamped over his mouth. "Excuse me, sir. I have reason to believe that you can help me with my inquiries." The man struggled, but Vimes knew every trick when it came to apprehending a suspect. He hissed, "You know who I am, sir, and I know what you are. We're both coppers, and we've been around the houses, and you said that the barman sees everything, hears everything, and he says nothing. And I'm a fair man, Mr. Jiminy, but I'm investigating a murder. A murder, sir, the capital crime, and maybe something much, much worse. So excuse me if I take the view that those who aren't behind me are standing in my way, with all that entails." Jiminy was running out of breath now, and squirming feebly. "Oh, too much of the booze and too little walking the beat, I fancy," said Vimes. "Now, I would not ask a man to break the barman's solemn oath, so when I take my hand away, we'll sit down peacefully and play a little game of charades. I'm letting go now." The barman wheezed a curse and added, "You didn't need to do that, Commander. I've got a bad chest, you know." "Not as bad as it might otherwise be, Mr. Jiminy. And now a word on the subject of being too clever." The Republican glared as Vimes went on. I'm strictly a copper. I don't kill people unless they're trying to kill me. You may be aware of my Batman, Mr. Willikins. You saw him the other day. Regrettably, he's more direct and also extremely loyal. A few years ago, to save my family, he killed an armed dwarf with a common ice knife. And he has other talents. Among them, I have to say, is that he can iron a shirt as crisply as any man I know. And I say, very loyal indeed. Come on, Jiminy. I'm a copper, and you're a copper. You're still a copper, whatever you say. The stain never leaves you. You know what I can do, and I know what you can do, and you're smart enough to choose the right side. All right, you don't need to rub it in, Jiminy grumbled. We both know about the ins and outs. His voice was suddenly and almost theatrically helpful as he crooned. How may I help you, officer? Just like the good citizen that I am. Vimes carefully pulled out of his coat the little pot. It was indeed about the size of a snuff box. The incongruity was not lost on Vimes. In one pocket he held the glorious gem, quite likely the repository of goblin snot, and in the other he had his own small snuff box. How hilarious would it be if he'd mixed them up? Jiminy certainly reacted when he saw it, although he probably thought he hadn't. There is a subtle difference between hiding your reaction and showing that you are hiding your reaction. All right, Mr. Vimes. You're right. We don't have to play games. Old coppers like us. I give in. I know what that is. Seen one like it recently, as a matter of fact. And I can give you a name, Mr. Vimes. 'Cause why? 'Cause he's a nutjob, a toe rag, and he ain't from around here. Name of Stratford, or so they call him. A knife cove, the kind of bloke you never want to see walk through your pub. I don't mind telling you. He isn't often here, thank goodness. The other day was the first time I've seen him in months. I don't know where he keeps, but the snotty bugger, he was hanging out with his called Ted Flutter. Works for young Lord Rust up at Hangnail. His lordship is big in tobacco, so they tell me. Jiminy stopped. Vimes interpreted this in exactly the way Jiminy wanted, he was sure. Lord Rust was up to something. Jiminy was insinuating and throwing a bone to Vimes to get the man off his back. Some people would have thought this despicable, but the man was an ex-policeman after all. Jiminy gave a little cough as he endeavoured to find another victim for Vimes to pursue. But Flutter, well, you know, he's just a bloke. If someone needs help for something or other, he's the kind of bloke who'd be the lookout or be told to take away the boats. When not up to mischief, I think he hangs wallpapers and runs a turkey farm up on the road to an overhang. You can't miss it. It's a stinky old place, and he doesn't take care of his birds, not entirely all there, in my opinion. Vimes, seizing his opening. Tobacco, eh? Oh yes, Mr. Jiminy. I did think I smelled rather more tobacco down here than might otherwise be expected. And, of course, as a policeman, it's something that I'll have to look into. Perhaps when time allows. He winked, and Jiminy nodded knowingly. With the atmosphere now tentatively upbeat, Jiminy said, They brings a few barrels up here some nights, and then picks it up again as and when. All right, I know it's the revenue and all that, but I don't see the harm. And since we understand one another so well, Mr. Vimes, I've been here for only 3 years. I know there was some stuff way back. Maybe they did scrag a few goblins. I don't know. Not my business. Don't know why. Don't know who, if you get my meaning. Jiminy was sweating like a pig, Vimes noticed. There are times when reacting the way that simple, common decency requires fails to serve a higher purpose, and because of this, Vimes merely gave the man a little smile and said, "One day, Mr. Jiminy, I'll bring a lady here. I think she'd be very interested to see your establishment." Jiminy was puzzled but had the grace to say, "I'll look forward to it, Commander." "What I'm trying to say," said Vimes, "is that if this pub still has the head of a goblin hanging over the bar the next time I'm here, there'll be a mysterious fire. Do you understand? No doubt you want to keep in with young Lord Rust and his chums, because it always pays to keep in with the powerful. I know that well enough. You'll find me a good friend, Mr. Jiminy, and I'd like to suggest to you that it would not be in your interest to have Commander Vimes as your enemy. Just a word to the wise, you know? 1 copper to another." With forced cheerfulness, Jiminy said in a voice that dripped butter and sugar, "No one ever said that Constable Jiminy didn't know how the wind was blowing. And since you've been so gracious as to visit my humble establishment, I think I can take the view that the wind has begun to blow due, Vimes." Vimes lifted the cellar hatch to depart and said, "Oh, so do I, Mr. Jiminy, so do I. And if ever the weathercock decides to blow the other way, I'll bite its bloody head off." Jiminy smiled uncertainly and said, "Do you have jurisdiction here, Commander?" and was dragged by the shirt to within an inch of Vimes's face, eyeball to eyeball. And Vimes said, "Try me." Feeling rather chirpy after this interlude, Vimes jogged to the lane that led to the hill and found Miss Beadle and Tears of the Mushroom at the door of the cottage. By the look of it, they had been picking apples. Several baskets of fruit had been piled up. He thought that Tears of the Mushroom smiled when she saw him, although how could you tell, really? Goblin faces were hard to read. The pot was dutifully traded back for the picture, and Vimes couldn't help noticing, because he always made a point of noticing, that both he and the girl tried surreptitiously to examine their precious items without causing offense. He was sure he heard Miss Beadle stifle a sigh of relief. "Did you find the murderer?" she said, leaning forward anxiously. She turned to the girl. "Go inside, dear, while I talk to Commander Vimes, will you?"
"Yes, Miss Beadle. I will go inside as you request."
There it was again, a language of little boxes, opening and shutting as required. The girl disappeared into the house, and Vimes said, "I have information that 2 men were in the pub on the night of the murder, and one of them certainly had a pot. Neither of them, I've been led to believe, was a pillar of society." Miss Beadle clapped her hands. "Well, that's good, isn't it? You have them banged to rights." It always embarrassed Samuel Vimes when civilians tried to speak to him in what they thought was policemen. If it came to that, he hated thinking of them as civilians. What was a policeman if not a civilian with a uniform and a badge? But they tended to use the term these days as a way of describing people who were not policemen. It was a dangerous habit. Once policemen stopped being civilians, The other thing they could be was soldiers. He sighed. As far as I know, miss, it is not illegal to have a goblin pot. Neither is it, strictly speaking, illegal to be described as not a pillar of society. Do goblins sign their pots in some way? Oh, yes, indeed, Commander. Goblin pots are always distinctive. Do these criminals have a modus operandi? Vimes's heart sank. No, and I don't think they'd know one if they saw it. He tried to say this firmly because Miss Beadle looked as if she would, at any moment, turn out with a magnifying glass and a bloodhound. Then, falling across his world like a rainbow of sound, came music, drifting out of the open cottage window. He listened with his mouth open, entirely forgetting the conversation. His Grace the Duke of Ankh, Commander Sir Samuel Vimes, was not a man who made a point of frequenting performances of classical music, or indeed any music that you couldn't whistle on the way home. But apparently, being a knob carried with it a requirement to attend the opera, the ballet, and as many musical events as Sybil could drag him to. Fortunately, they generally had a box, and Sybil, very wisely, having dragged him to the performance, did not subsequently drag him into consciousness. But some of it seeped through, and it was enough for him to know that what he was hearing was the real high-brow stuff. You couldn't hum it, and at no point did anybody shout, "Whoops! Have a banana!" It was the pure quill of music, a sound that came close to making you want to fall on your knees and promise to be a better person. He turned wordlessly to Miss Beadle, who said, "She's very good, isn't she?" "That's a harp, isn't it? A goblin playing a harp?" Miss Beadle seemed embarrassed by the fuss. "Certainly. Why shouldn't she? Strangely enough, her large hands are suited to the instrument. I don't think she understands the concept of reading music yet, and I have to help her tune it, but she does play very well. Heaven knows where she's getting the music from." "Heaven?" said Vimes, adding urgently, "How long will she be playing? Have I got time to bring Sybil over here?" He didn't wait for an answer, but hurried off down the lane, clambered over a gate, caused a flock of sheep to explode in all directions, swore at a kissing gate, jumped over the ha-ha, completely ignored the he-he, and totally avoided the ho-hum. He hurtled down the drive, scampered up the steps, and, providentially, went through the front door at exactly the same time as a footman swung it open. Sybil was taking tea with a group of ladies, which appeared to be obligatory procedure in the afternoons, but Vimes leaned against the wall and panted out, "You must come and listen to this music. Bring young Sam. Bring these ladies if they want to come. But whatever you do, come on. I've never heard anything so good." Sybil looked around. "Well, we were just breaking up, Sam. You know you look very flushed. Is anything the matter?" She looked imploringly at her friends, who were already rising in their seats, and said, "I do hope you'll forgive me, ladies. It's so very difficult being the wife of an important man." There was a slight barb to the last syllable. "I'm sure, Sam, that whatever it is can wait until I've said goodbye to my guests, yes?" And so Sam Vimes shook hands, smiled, shook hands, smiled and fretted until the last twitterer had tweeted and the last lady had left. Having seen the final carriage away, Lady Sybil came back in, flopped into a chair in front of Sam, and listened to Vimes's garbled account. And this is that young goblin girl Miss Beadle has been teaching to talk? Vimes was almost frantic. Yes! And she plays wonderful music. Wonderful! Sam Vimes, when I take you to a concert, you fall asleep in 10 minutes. Do you know what? You've convinced me. Let's go, shall we? Where? Said Vimes in husbandly confusion. Sybil affected surprise. Why, to hear the young lady play the harp, of course. I thought that was what you wanted. I'll go and get my jacket while you find young Sam, please. He's in the laboratory. For Vimes' bewilderment was now accumulating. The laboratory, Sam. You know my family were famous meddlers, don't you? Willikins is in there with him, and I believe they're dissecting some, shall I say, excrement? Make certain they've both washed their hands thoroughly, she added on the way out of the room. And tell them I was emphatic, and tell young Sam what emphatic means. The coach stood empty in the lane. They hadn't dared knock on the door, not while that heavenly music was drifting out of the cottage window. Sybil was in tears, but often she looked up and said things like, "That shouldn't be possible on a harp." Even young Sam was transfixed, standing there with his little mouth open while the music rushed in and, for a moment, upon the world, lifted all hearts and forgave all sins, not having its work cut out in the case of young Sam. A part of Vimes managed to reflect, but doing a sterling and heavyweight job on his father. And when the music stopped, young Sam said, "More!" And that went for his parents too. They stood there, not looking at one another, and then the cottage door opened, and Miss Beadle stepped out. "I saw you out there, of course. Do come in, but quietly. I've made lemonade." She led them through the hall and turned into the living room. Tears of the Mushroom must have been forewarned by Miss Beadle. She sat on a chair next to the harp with her oversized hands clasped demurely over her apron. Wordlessly, young Sam walked over to her and cuddled her leg. The goblin girl looked panicky, and Vimes said, "Don't worry, he just wants to show that he loves you." And he thought, "I've just told a goblin not to be frightened of my son because he loves her and the world has turned upside down and all sins are forgiven, except possibly mine." As the coach rattled gently back toward Ramkin Hall, Lady Sybil said quietly to Vimes, "I understand that the young lady goblin who was murdered could play the harp as well as Miss Mushroom?" Vimes stirred from his inner thoughts and said, "I didn't know that." "Oh, yes," said Sybil in a curiously chatty voice. "Apparently, Miss Beadle wants young goblin girls to have something to be proud of." She cleared her throat and after a pause said, "Do you have any suspects, Sam?" "Oh, yes, 2. I have the testimony of a reliable witness that they were in the area after the event, and I'm beginning to consider a chain of events that might lead me also to the whereabouts of Mr. Jefferson the Smith. This is the countryside after all. Everyone sees where you go, and you never know who is behind a hedge. I believe they may have heard him invite me to Dead Man's Copse on what the Times would call that fateful night." Sybil looked down at young Sam, dozing between them, and said, "Do you know where they live?" "Yes, one of them at least. I think the other one just hangs around, as they say." And now the rattle of gravel under wheel told them that they were going down the long drive. Sybil cleared her throat again and in a quiet voice said, "I fear you may have felt that I was being rather acerbic to you, Sam." Acerbic, A-C-E-R-B-I-C, acerbic, sharply or bitingly critical, sarcastic or ironic in temper, mood or tone, acerbic. "I fear you may have felt that I was being rather acerbic to you, Sam, on the subject of letting your professional concerns get in the way of our holiday. I may, at times, have been somewhat blunt."
"Not at all, Sybil. I fully understood your concern."
It seemed that Lady Sybil really could have done with some cough drops, but she carried on carefully and said, "Sam, I'd be very grateful if you could see your way clear to perhaps taking Willikins with you to wherever it is that these scoundrels poison the world with their existence and bring them to justice, if you would be so good." He could feel her trembling with rage and said,
"I was considering doing so as soon as possible, my dear. But I must tell you that things may not go entirely in accordance with the rule book. After all, I'm out of my jurisdiction here."
But his wife said, "You're a stickler for the book, Sam, and I admire that. But the jurisdiction of a good man extends to the end of the world, though who will you take them to? Havelock would hang them, you know that, but he's a long way away. Nonetheless, Sam, I am certain of one thing, and it's this. The worst thing you can do is nothing. Go to it, Sam."
"Actually, Sybil, I was considering delivering them to the local justices."
"What? They're a terrible bunch, apparently using what they call the law here for their own ends. There'll be an enormous stink." Vimes smiled.
"Oh dear, do you really think so?"
There was no point going to bed, thought Vimes later that evening, and so he kissed his wife good night and went to the snooker room, where Willikins was idly demonstrating one of the more socially acceptable skills he had learned during a misspent youth. The man straightened up when Vimes walked in and said, "Good evening, Commander. Would you like a sustaining drink to be going on with?" Vimes also indulged in a rare cigar, because, well, what good is a snooker room without smoke twisting among the lights and turning the air a desolate blue, the colour of dead hopes and lost chances? Willikins, who knew the protocol, waited until Vimes had made his shot before coughing gently. "Oh, well done, sir. And I understand that her ladyship is somewhat vexed about the goblin situation, sir?" "I believe this to be the case, sir, because I met her in the corridor earlier, and she used language I haven't heard on the lips of a woman since my old mother passed away. God bless her soul, if they can find it. But, well done again, sir." Vimes laid his cue aside.
"I want to get them all, Willikins. It's no good slamming up some local thug."
"Yes, indeed, Commander. It's all about potting the black." Vimes looked up from his fiery drink.
"I can see you must have played a lot in your time, Willikins. Did you ever see Pelvic Williams? Very religious man in his way. Lives somewhere in Hen and Chickens Court with his sister. Played like I've never seen anyone else play before or since. I swear, he could make a ball jump the table, roll along the edge, and drop back into the cloth just where he wanted it, to drop neatly into the pocket."
Vimes gave a grunt of satisfaction and went on.
"Of course, everyone used to say that was cheating, but he used to stand there as meek as milk, just repeating, 'The ball dropped.'" tell you the truth, the reason he never got beaten up was that it was an education watching the man. He once sank a ball by bouncing it off the lamp and a pint mug. But, like he said, the ball dropped. Vimes relaxed and said, "The trouble is, of course, that in real life rules are more stringent." "Yes, indeed, Commander," said Willikins. "Where I used to play, the only rule was that after you'd hit your opponent over the head with your cue, you had to be able to run very fast. I understand from her ladyship that you might be requiring my assistance tonight?" "Yes, please. We're going to the village of Hangnails. It's about 20 miles upriver." Willikins nodded. "Yes, indeed, sir. Once the seat of the Hangnail family, and most notably the Lord Justice Hangnail, who famously declared that he never took account of any plea of not guilty on the basis that criminals always lie, and was, by happy chance, the worshipful master of the benevolent Company of Rope Makers and Braiders. With any luck, will not see his like again." "Excellent, Willikins. And we'll stop en route to pick up our keen young local constable, who'll see fair play. I intend to make sure of that." "Glad to hear it, sir," said Willikins. "But bear this in mind. What does it matter once the ball has dropped?"